When people hear the words BSD and Linux in 2026, many still assume they are basically the same thing, or that BSD is just some forgotten cousin of Linux that only hardcore Unix purists care about. But the reality today is very different. In 2026, the BSD versus Linux discussion is no longer about which one is better in some abstract ideological sense. It is about design philosophy, licensing freedom, real-world deployment, long-term stability, corporate influence, developer control, and how each ecosystem has evolved under very different pressures over the last 3 decades. To truly understand BSD versus Linux today, we need to go beyond surface-level comparisons and actually understand what these systems are, how they are built, why they behave the way they do, and why certain organizations still swear by BSD while the rest of the world runs Linux almost everywhere. Let's start by clearing up one of the biggest misconceptions. Linux is not an operating system in the traditional sense. Linux is a kernel. Everything you interact with on a Linux desktop or server comes from a combination of the Linux kernel and a large collection of userland tools, most of which come from the GNU project or other open-source initiatives. That's why Linux appears in so many different forms, from Ubuntu and Fedora to Arch, Alpine, Android, and countless custom enterprise distributions. BSD, on the other hand, is a complete operating system. When you install FreeBSD, OpenBSD, or NetBSD, you're installing a tightly integrated system where the kernel, userland, core utilities, and base system are all developed together under a single coordinated project. This difference alone explains many of the philosophical and practical differences between BSD and Linux in 2026. In the Linux world, diversity is both a strength and a weakness. Linux thrives on fragmentation and choice. Different distributions exist to serve different purposes, whether that's bleeding-edge development, enterprise stability, minimal containers, or desktop convenience. In 2026, Linux dominates cloud infrastructure, supercomputers, embedded devices, and increasingly the desktop, thanks to massive improvements in hardware compatibility, Wayland maturity, and gaming support through Proton and Vulkan. But this diversity also means inconsistency. Package formats differ, init systems differ, release models differ, and standards evolve unevenly across distributions. For experienced users, this flexibility is empowering. For newcomers and large organizations, it can be overwhelming. BSD takes the opposite approach. BSD systems prioritize consistency, correctness, and long-term predictability over rapid innovation. In a BSD system, everything feels cohesive because it is designed to be cohesive. Configuration files follow predictable patterns, system behavior remains stable across upgrades, and documentation is written with the assumption that users want to understand how the system works internally. In 2026, this makes BSD extremely attractive for infrastructure roles where reliability and auditability matter more than having the newest features. Firewalls, storage servers, network appliances, and security-critical systems continue to rely heavily on BSD, especially FreeBSD and OpenBSD. One of the most important differences between BSD and Linux is licensing, and this difference has become even more relevant in 2026 as governments and corporations rethink their dependency on open-source software. Linux uses the GPL, which enforces copyleft. If you modify the Linux kernel and distribute it, you must make your source code available under the same license. This has helped Linux grow massively because improvements are shared back with the community. However, it has also made some companies cautious about deep kernel customization. BSD uses a permissive license that allows companies to take the code, modify it, and even keep those modifications proprietary. This is why BSD code quietly powers many commercial systems without public attribution. In 2026, Apple still uses BSD components in macOS and iOS. Sony uses BSD in PlayStation systems, and countless networking products rely on BSD TCP/IP stacks. This licensing difference also shapes the culture of development. Linux development is loud, fast, and highly collaborative, but also sometimes chaotic. Decisions are influenced by major corporate contributors like Red Hat, Google, Intel, and AMD. In 2026, Linux kernel development is faster than ever, but it is also more complex, with increasing concerns about maintainability and the growing learning curve for new contributors. BSD development is slower and quieter, but extremely deliberate. Features are not merged unless they meet strict quality standards. This makes BSD feel conservative, but it also means that when something lands in BSD, it is usually very well thought out. Security is another area where BSD and Linux diverge significantly. Linux security in 2026 is powerful but layered. Tools like SLinux, AppArmor, namespace, groups, and sandboxing frameworks provide extremely granular control, but they also add complexity. Properly securing a Linux system requires knowledge of many moving parts. BSD, especially OpenBSD, focuses on security by default. Features like privilege separation, secure memory handling, and proactive auditing are baked directly into the base system. OpenBSD developers famously audit their entire codebase regularly, and in 2026, OpenBSD still has an unmatched reputation for correctness and minimalism. FreeBSD, while more performance-oriented, also benefits from a simpler and more transparent security model compared to Linux. Performance is often misunderstood in the BSD versus Linux debate. Linux generally wins in raw performance benchmarks, especially on modern hardware, because it benefits from massive corporate optimization and driver support. In 2026, Linux is the undisputed king of high-performance computing and AI workloads. BSD, however, often delivers more consistent performance under sustained load, particularly in networking and storage. FreeBSD's networking stack ZFS integration and jail system remain industry-leading. Many CDN providers and storage vendors still prefer FreeBSD because it offers predictable behavior under extreme network traffic. When it comes to containers and virtualization, Linux clearly dominates. Docker, Kubernetes, and container ecosystems are built around Linux primitives. In 2026, Linux is the backbone of cloud-native infrastructure. BSD does have jails, which are older and arguably cleaner than Linux containers in concept, but the ecosystem around Linux containers is far larger. BSD virtualization exists through Bive and other tools, but it lacks the industry momentum Linux enjoys. This doesn't make BSD obsolete, but it does position it as a specialist rather than a generalist platform. On the desktop, the comparison becomes even more interesting. Linux desktops in 2026 are genuinely competitive with Windows and Mac OS. Hardware compatibility has improved dramatically. Wayland is stable, fractional scaling works, and gaming performance is no longer a joke. BSD desktops, while functional, remain niche. Hardware support is limited, especially for modern GPUs and laptops. BSD desktop users tend to be enthusiasts who value system transparency over convenience. In this sense, BSD desktops feel more like a philosophical choice than a practical one for most users. Documentation is an area where BSD continues to shine. BSD man pages are legendary for their clarity and completeness. In a BSD system, documentation is treated as a first-class feature. Linux documentation has improved significantly, especially with community wikis and official guides, but it remains fragmented. In 2026, Linux users often rely on forums, GitHub issues, and third-party tutorials, while BSD users rely on official documentation that is tightly coupled to the system itself. Community culture also differs greatly. Linux communities are massive, diverse, and sometimes hostile to newcomers. BSD communities are smaller, quieter, and more conservative, but often more welcoming to serious learners. In 2026, Linux is everywhere, which means its community reflects the entire spectrum of tech culture. BSD feels more like a private workshop where people who deeply care about systems programming gather to build something elegant. So which one is better in 2026? The honest answer is that BSD and Linux are no longer competing for the same audience. Linux is the default choice for most workloads because it offers unmatched hardware support, ecosystem depth, and industry adoption. BSD is the deliberate choice for people and organizations that value control, predictability, and long-term stability over rapid change. Linux is about scale. BSD is about craftsmanship. In a way, BSD represents what operating systems used to be, while Linux represents what operating systems have become. One is slow, careful, and opinionated. The other is fast, flexible, and shaped by global collaboration. Both are open source, both are powerful, and both continue to influence each other in subtle ways. In 2026, the real winner is not BSD or Linux, but the open source ecosystem as a whole, which continues to thrive because these two philosophies coexist rather than replace one another. If you are choosing between BSD and Linux today, The question you should ask is not which one is better, but which one aligns with how you think about computers. If you want maximum compatibility, cutting-edge features, and industry relevance, Linux is the obvious choice. If you want a system that feels intentional, transparent, and deeply engineered, BSD might surprise you. And in a world increasingly dominated by abstraction and automation, that alone makes BSD more relevant in 2026 than many people realize.